In the shadowed corridors of history, beneath the gilded facades of royal palaces and soaring cathedral spires, a machinery of terror operated with chilling precision. The year was 1478, and across the newly unified Kingdom of Spain, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella had sanctioned an institution that would become synonymous with systematic cruelty and religious persecution. The Spanish Inquisition emerged not as a spontaneous outbreak of fanaticism, but as a carefully orchestrated instrument of power, designed to forge religious unity through fear, torture, and death. For over 3 centuries, until its final abolition in 1834, this bureaucratic apparatus of suffering would cast its shadow across Spain and its vast colonial empire, reaching into the Americas with tentacles of terror that spared no corner of the Spanish world. What distinguished the Spanish Inquisition from other forms of persecution was not merely its duration or geographic scope, but its methodical, almost scientific approach to human suffering. This was persecution refined into an art form, torture elevated to a bureaucratic procedure, and cruelty systematized with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. The Inquisition's meticulous record-keeping has left historians with an unprecedented archive of human suffering. These documents, preserved in dusty archives across Spain and the Americas, reveal not just the scope of the persecution, but its intimate details. Every confession extracted under torture, every scream echoing from stone chambers, every broken body carried from interrogation rooms was documented with bureaucratic thoroughness. Through these records, we can peer into a world where the pursuit of religious orthodoxy became a license for unimaginable cruelty. Within this machinery of repression, women occupied a particularly vulnerable position. While they represented a minority of the cases brought before the tribunals, their experiences reveal an intersection of religious persecution and gender-based violence that created unique horrors. Women faced not only the standard tortures applied to male heretics, but also gender-specific forms of abuse that targeted their bodies in ways that reflected the deep-seated misogyny of the era. The Inquisition's treatment of women was characterized by a particular brutality that often focused on their sexuality and reproductive capacity, transforming religious persecution into a form of gendered terror. The origins of the Spanish Inquisition lay in the political ambitions of Ferdinand and Isabella, who sought to consolidate their newly unified kingdom through religious homogeneity. The presence of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, provided a convenient target for suspicion. These new Christians, as they were known, faced constant scrutiny for signs that they might be secretly practicing Judaism. For women in converso families, this scrutiny extended into the most intimate aspects of their domestic lives. The preparation of food, the lighting of candles, the washing of clothes, even the patterns of smoke from their chimneys became potential evidence of heretical behavior. The establishment of the Inquisition in 1478 marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would transform Spanish society. Unlike previous Inquisitions that had focused primarily on rooting out organized heretical movements, the Spanish Inquisition turned its attention to the private beliefs and practices of individuals. This shift created a climate of suspicion that penetrated into the heart of family life, where traditional bonds of loyalty and trust became sources of mortal danger. The first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, established the procedural framework that would govern the institution for centuries. His 28-article code, based on earlier inquisitorial manuals, created a systematic approach to persecution that combined legal procedures with torture methods in a way that provided a veneer of judicial legitimacy to what was essentially state-sponsored terrorism. This bureaucratization of cruelty meant that torture was not applied randomly or in fits of passion, but according to carefully established protocols designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. Women who fell under the Inquisition's scrutiny faced accusations that were often tied to their gender roles and domestic responsibilities. The practice of folk medicine, which many women engaged in as healers and midwives, could easily be construed as witchcraft. The maintenance of dietary laws that might suggest crypto-Judaism became a particular focus of suspicion for converso women. Even expressions of religious opinion that challenged male authority within the church or family could lead to charges of heresy. The interrogation process began long before the accused ever saw the inside of a torture chamber. The Inquisition's network of informants created a web of surveillance that made normal social interaction fraught with danger. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Servants were questioned about their employers' private practices, and even family members were pressured to denounce their relatives. For women, this meant that the traditional networks of female friendship and support became potential sources of betrayal. The formal proceedings against accused women followed a pattern that was designed to break down psychological resistance before physical torture even began. The arrest itself was often conducted in secrecy, with the accused simply disappearing from their homes without explanation to their families. They were then held in solitary confinement in cells designed to create maximum psychological distress. These chambers were deliberately constructed to be cramped, damp, and poorly lit, creating conditions that would wear down mental resistance over weeks or months of isolation. During this preliminary phase, the accused were subjected to repeated interrogations designed to identify inconsistencies in their stories and to extract information about other potential heretics. The psychological pressure was immense, as the accused knew that their responses could determine not only their own fate, but also that of family members and friends who might be implicated in their testimony. For women, there was the additional burden of knowing that their children might be left orphaned if they were condemned to death. The legal procedures of the Inquisition were structured to make conviction almost inevitable. The accused were not informed of the specific charges against them, nor were they allowed to know the identity of their accusers. This meant that mounting an effective defense was virtually impossible, as the accused could not address specific allegations or challenge the credibility of witnesses. The burden of proof was effectively reversed, with the accused required to demonstrate their innocence rather than the prosecution proving guilt. When the preliminary interrogations failed to produce satisfactory confessions, the inquisitors would order the accused to be shown the instruments of torture. This psychological torture was often as effective as physical abuse, as the sight of the implements and the detailed explanation of how they would be used frequently broke down resistance. For women, this preview of suffering was particularly traumatic, as many of the devices were specifically designed to target female anatomy in ways that combined physical agony with sexual humiliation. The torture chambers themselves were carefully designed spaces that maximized both the suffering of victims and the psychological impact on witnesses. These rooms were typically located in the basement levels of Inquisition buildings, where the stone walls would muffle screams while the dampness and poor ventilation created an atmosphere of dread. The chambers contained an array of mechanical devices, each calibrated to inflict specific types of pain, while avoiding immediate death, which would end the interrogation process prematurely. The systematic nature of the torture meant that inquisitors could apply graduated levels of pain, beginning with psychological intimidation and escalating through various physical techniques until the desired confession was obtained. This process could extend over weeks or months, with torture sessions interspersed with periods of solitary confinement designed to allow the psychological impact of the abuse to take full effect. The goal was not simply to extract information, but to create a complete breakdown of the victim's will and identity. For women subjected to this treatment, the experience was compounded by the gender-specific nature of many torture devices and techniques. The Inquisition's arsenal included implements specifically designed to target female anatomy, reflecting both the misogynistic attitudes of the era and the particular fears about female sexuality and autonomy that permeated medieval and early modern society. The arsenal of torture employed against women during the Spanish Inquisition represented a calculated fusion of religious persecution and gendered violence that transformed the female body into a site of theological warfare. The three primary methods officially sanctioned by the institution were refined through decades of experimentation into instruments of precise cruelty, each calibrated to extract maximum suffering while preserving life long enough to obtain the desired confessions. The garrucha, known in other contexts as the strappado, became one of the most frequently employed techniques against female victims. The process began with the binding of the woman's hands behind her back using coarse rope that would cut into the flesh as pressure increased. A pulley system mounted on the ceiling allowed the torturer to slowly lift the victim from the ground, forcing her entire body weight to be supported by shoulders wrenched into an unnatural position. The deliberate pace of this elevation created anticipatory terror as the victim realized what was about to occur, while the final moment of lifting brought immediate, excruciating pain as joints separated and tendons stretched beyond their natural limits. For women, the garrucha carried additional dimensions of humiliation and vulnerability. The positioning required for the torture often exposed the body in ways that compounded physical agony with sexual degradation. The inquisitors understood that this exposure served dual purposes, both breaking down psychological resistance and reinforcing the power dynamic between the male torturers and their female victims. The addition of weights to the feet, a common variation of the technique, created a pendulum effect that could dislocate multiple joints simultaneously while the victim swayed helplessly in the air. The water torture, known as toca, represented perhaps the most insidious form of psychological warfare in the Inquisition's arsenal. This technique began with the victim being strapped to a slanted wooden board using cords that bit deep into the flesh. The positioning was crucial, with the head placed lower than the feet to maximize the sensation of drowning that would follow. A thin cloth was then forced into the victim's mouth and throat, creating an immediate sense of suffocation even before the water began to flow. The application of water through the saturated cloth created a controlled drowning experience that could be precisely regulated by the torturer. Jars of water, sometimes totaling 8 quarts or more, were slowly poured over the cloth, causing it to swell and block the airways while creating the terrifying sensation of inhaling liquid. The victim's natural reflexes would cause violent gagging and retching, but the restraints prevented any escape from the mounting panic as oxygen deprivation began to affect consciousness. What made the toca particularly effective was its ability to create lasting psychological trauma without leaving permanent physical marks. Women who survived this torture often experienced recurring nightmares and panic attacks triggered by the sight or sound of flowing water. The technique could be repeated multiple times during a single session, with brief respites allowed for interrogation before the process resumed. This intermittent application created a cycle of terror and relief that often proved more psychologically devastating than continuous physical pain. The mechanical sophistication of the potro, or rack, elevated torture to the level of engineering precision. This device consisted of a rectangular wooden frame equipped with rollers at each end, connected by an intricate system of chains and pulleys that allowed for graduated application of tension. The victim would be positioned with hands secured to one end and feet to the other, creating a human bridge that could be slowly stretched beyond the natural limits of joints and ligaments. The psychological impact of the rack began before any physical stretching occurred. The mechanical sounds of the device as it was prepared, the clicking of ratchets and the creaking of wood under tension, created an atmosphere of inevitable doom that often broke resistance before the actual torture began. For female victims, there was the added horror of being completely exposed and helpless while male inquisitors and their assistants operated the machinery of their destruction. As tension was applied through the turning of handles and adjustment of chains, the body would begin to stretch with methodical precision. The first sensations were of uncomfortable pulling, followed by sharp pains as joints reached their natural limits. Continued application of pressure would produce the distinctive sounds of separating joints, snapping tendons, and stretching ligaments that witnesses described as both horrifying and oddly compelling. These auditory elements of torture were deliberately emphasized by the inquisitors, who understood their psychological impact on both victims and observers. The rack's mechanical precision allowed torturers to calibrate the exact degree of stretching applied, creating a graduated scale of suffering that could be precisely controlled. Initial applications might only cause severe pain and temporary joint displacement, while continued use would result in permanent damage to muscles, ligaments, and skeletal structure. The most extreme applications could literally tear limbs from the body, though this ultimate outcome was typically avoided as it would end the interrogation process. Women subjected to the rack faced particular vulnerabilities due to physiological differences that made certain forms of damage more likely. The stretching process affected reproductive organs and could cause internal injuries that would create long-term health problems even for those who survived. The positioning required for the rack also created opportunities for sexual humiliation that formed an integral part of the psychological torture inflicted alongside the physical abuse. Beyond these three primary methods, women faced an array of gender-specific torture devices that revealed the intersection of religious persecution with deeply rooted fears about female sexuality and autonomy. The breast ripper, consisting of iron claws designed to tear flesh from women's breasts, served both punitive and interrogative purposes. This device was employed not only to extract confessions but also to mark women who had been convicted of religious crimes, creating permanent disfigurement that would serve as a lifelong reminder of their punishment. The application of the breast ripper required the victim to be secured against a wall or post, preventing any movement that might lessen the devastating effect of the claws. The torturer would grip the iron implement and pull forcibly away from the body, tearing through skin, muscle, and mammary tissue with deliberate slowness to maximize both pain and the psychological impact on witnesses. The resulting wounds were often infected deliberately or left untreated, creating additional suffering that could persist for months after the initial torture. Another device specifically designed for women was the pear of anguish, a mechanical implement that targeted the most intimate aspects of female anatomy. This pear-shaped device consisted of metal segments that could be expanded through the turning of a screw mechanism, creating internal damage that was both excruciating and deeply violating. The psychological impact of this torture was as significant as its physical effects, as it transformed the victim's own body into an instrument of suffering while destroying the most private and personal aspects of her identity. The vaginal pear was inserted and then gradually expanded, tearing internal tissues and creating injuries that would heal slowly and painfully if the victim survived. The deliberate targeting of reproductive organs served multiple purposes within the Inquisition's logic, both punishing women for alleged sexual crimes and symbolically destroying their capacity for the motherhood that was central to medieval concepts of female identity. The use of this device was often accompanied by explicit theological justifications that framed the torture as divine punishment for sins against religious and sexual orthodoxy. These gender-specific tortures were not merely cruel innovations designed to cause additional suffering, but reflected a systematic theology of punishment that viewed women's bodies as inherently corrupted and in need of purification through pain. The targeting of specifically female anatomy served to reinforce patriarchal religious authority while providing inquisitors with leverage over victims who might otherwise resist conventional forms of torture. The threat of sexual violence and reproductive destruction created additional psychological pressure that could break resistance even before physical torture began. The intersection of religious persecution and gendered violence created unique forms of trauma for women who survived the Inquisition's torture chambers. Beyond the immediate physical damage, these experiences created lasting psychological wounds that affected not only the direct victims, but also the broader community of women who lived under the constant threat of such treatment. The knowledge that religious authorities could subject women to these specific forms of abuse created a climate of fear that extended far beyond the walls of Inquisition prisons, shaping the behavior and choices of women throughout Spanish society. The documentation of these tortures reveals the bureaucratic precision with which the Inquisition approached human suffering. Each session was meticulously recorded by scribes who noted not only the methods employed but also the victims' responses, the duration of torture, and the confessions extracted. These records, preserved in archives across Spain, provide a chilling testament to the systematic nature of this persecution. The clerks would document every scream, every plea for mercy, every moment when resistance finally broke, creating an administrative record of agony that treated human suffering as merely another form of paperwork. The case of Ana Acosta illuminates the particular vulnerability of young women within this machinery of persecution. At merely 15 years old, this converso girl from Seville found herself imprisoned for an entire year under accusations of practicing Judaism. The circumstances of her case reveal how adolescent behavior could be twisted into evidence of heretical activity through the lens of inquisitorial suspicion. When guards discovered her naked in her cell, claiming to receive visits from a figure in white robes, the incident was immediately interpreted as potential evidence of witchcraft or false mysticism. The involvement of physicians in Ana's case demonstrates the sophisticated yet fundamentally flawed attempts at psychological evaluation within the Inquisition system. The court-appointed doctor diagnosed her with hypochondriac melancholia, a condition believed to originate in the digestive system and potentially inherited from her Jewish ancestry. This medical opinion reveals how even mental health was viewed through the distorted lens of religious orthodoxy, with the implication that Jewish blood might predispose someone to both mental illness and heretical behavior. The physician's concern about hereditary predisposition created an additional layer of persecution, suggesting that Ana's suffering might be predetermined by her very lineage. For a 15-year-old girl to endure a year of imprisonment, regardless of the final disposition of her case, represents a profound violation that extended far beyond mere detention. The psychological impact of prolonged isolation, constant interrogation, and the ever-present threat of torture would have been devastating for someone at such a formative stage of life. Ana's nakedness, interpreted as evidence of demonic visitation rather than psychological distress, demonstrates how the Inquisition's worldview transformed normal human responses to trauma into additional grounds for persecution. The broader social impact of these gender-specific tortures created ripples of terror that extended throughout Spanish society like stones cast into still water. Women learned to modify their behavior in countless subtle ways, avoiding actions that might trigger suspicion while navigating the dangerous currents of daily life under inquisitorial surveillance. The simple act of not producing chimney smoke on Saturdays could lead to accusations of secret Jewish observance. Purchasing vegetables before Passover or visiting a converso butcher became potentially fatal decisions that could result in denunciation and arrest. The Inquisition's network of informants transformed ordinary social relationships into sources of mortal danger. Neighbors watched each other with suspicious eyes. Servants reported on their employers' private habits, and even family members found themselves pressured to betray their own relatives to demonstrate their Catholic orthodoxy. For women, this surveillance was particularly intense, as their domestic activities were subject to constant scrutiny and misinterpretation. The traditional networks of female friendship and mutual support that had sustained women through centuries of hardship became potential sources of betrayal and destruction. The psychological warfare employed by the Inquisition was as devastating as its physical tortures. The institution announced 30-day grace periods during which individuals were required to confess their own heresies and denounce others, including relatives and friends, for attending Jewish prayer meetings or engaging in other prohibited activities. This policy created an atmosphere where survival often depended on one's willingness to sacrifice others, turning communities against themselves in a frenzy of mutual accusation and betrayal. Women faced particular challenges during these periods of enforced denunciation. Their knowledge of domestic activities made them valuable sources of information about their neighbors' private practices, while their own vulnerability to accusation made cooperation with authorities a matter of survival. The moral compromises required to navigate this system created lasting psychological wounds that extended far beyond the immediate threat of torture or execution. Mothers found themselves forced to choose between protecting their children and maintaining their integrity, while daughters learned that filial piety loyalty might conflict with religious survival. The training of female guards and assistants within the Inquisition system created another layer of gendered violence that compounded the suffering of accused women. These women, recruited from the margins of society and trained in the techniques of surveillance and interrogation, became instruments of oppression against their own gender. Their participation in the torture process served multiple purposes for the inquisitors, providing female attendants for procedures that involved intimate examinations, while also demonstrating the corruption that heresy could supposedly bring to women who strayed from orthodox paths. The psychological profiles of these female collaborators reveal the complex dynamics of survival and complicity within totalitarian systems. Some were motivated by genuine religious fervor, believing that their participation in torture served divine purposes and helped save souls from eternal damnation. Others were driven by economic necessity, finding in the Inquisition one of the few sources of steady employment available to women of their social class. Still others may have been coerced into service through threats against their own families or communities. The presence of women among the torturers created additional psychological trauma for victims who found themselves betrayed not only by the broader system of persecution, but also by members of their own gender. The sight of women participating in or facilitating their torture violated fundamental expectations about female solidarity and compassion, creating confusion and despair that added to the physical agony of the interrogation process. This betrayal by other women served to isolate victims further, destroying their faith in the possibility of solidarity or mutual support among the oppressed. The economic dimensions of the Inquisition's persecution of women reveal another aspect of how gender intersected with religious terror to create unique forms of suffering. Women's property rights were limited under medieval law, but the Inquisition's confiscation policies could still devastate families by targeting the resources controlled by female household members. The seizure of dowries, household goods, and other assets associated with accused women could reduce entire families to destitution, creating economic incentives for denunciation that further corrupted social relationships. The impact on children of accused women created generational trauma that extended the Inquisition's reach far beyond its immediate victims. Children whose mothers were arrested, tortured, or executed faced not only the immediate trauma of loss, but also the long-term stigma associated with heretical lineage. These children often found themselves excluded from marriage prospects, professional opportunities, and social acceptance, creating a hereditary caste of the suspected that perpetuated the Inquisition's influence across generations. The documentation preserved in inquisitorial archives reveals the calculated nature of this multi-generational persecution. Records were maintained not only of those directly accused and punished, but also of their descendants, creating genealogies of suspicion that could be consulted decades after the original cases were resolved. This systematic tracking of bloodlines ensured that the sins of mothers could be visited upon their children and grandchildren, creating a form of inherited guilt that violated fundamental principles of individual responsibility and justice. The religious justifications offered for these practices reveal how theological doctrine was twisted to support systematic oppression of women. Inquisitors drew upon centuries of misogynistic religious tradition that portrayed women as inherently more susceptible to temptation and corruption than men. This theological framework provided intellectual cover for practices that might otherwise have been recognized as simple sadism, allowing perpetrators to view themselves as servants of divine justice rather than instruments of human cruelty. The sermons and treatises produced by inquisitorial theologians during this period demonstrate the sophisticated intellectual apparatus that supported the torture of women. These documents, preserved alongside the procedural records and torture accounts, reveal how learned men constructed elaborate justifications for practices that violated the most basic principles of Christian mercy and compassion. The contradiction between the religion's stated values of love and forgiveness and the reality of systematic torture was resolved through complex theological arguments that portrayed suffering as purification and cruelty as kindness. The Spanish Inquisition's systematic torture of women stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how religious authority can be weaponized against the vulnerable. These women, subjected to gender-specific horrors that combined physical agony with psychological warfare, remind us that the machinery of persecution always seeks its most defenseless targets. Their suffering, meticulously documented in archives across Spain, serves as an eternal warning against the dangers of unchecked power cloaked in divine authority.